The title of the paper that I'm going to present is New Actors in the Global Refugee Regime. It's very much a work in progress, but in a way the headline is States only actors in the global refugee regime, and increasingly in many areas they may not even be the most influential actors. So by way of background, there's a general assumption in work on the global refugee regime that the regime is predominantly state-centric. Its primary function is obviously as a corrective to a failure of the Westphalian state system. When states are unable or unwilling to ensure the fundamental rights of their own citizens, that's when the refugee regime kicks in to provide surrogate protection. The main instruments of the regime, the 1951 Convention and UNHCR, are intergovernmental in nature. And although NGOs are recognised as key implementing partners and sources of advocacy, states are generally assumed to be the dominant actors. In the words of the globalization and global governance scholar Jan-Art Scholter, the refugee regime has generally been assumed to be statist rather than polycentric. And most academic work on international relations and forced migration reflects this. Work on the international history of the regime, on the security implications of refugees, on international cooperation between states, on power relations between donors and hosts, is predominantly state-centric. And there are very few exceptions to that broad characterization. But that's in tension with a broader literature in global governance. For a long time, in work on other policy fields, from global trade governance to global health to the environment, the role of non-state actors has been widely recognized. Hall and Bierstecker, for instance, recognized the role of private authority in global governance, highlighting that a range of private actors, not only business but others, play a role at every stage of global governance: agenda setting, negotiation, implementation, monitoring, and enforcement. But despite work on private actors in migration more broadly, notably the recent book on the migration industry by Thomas Gammeltoft Hansen and Nina Nyberg Sorensen, non-state actors have been marginal to the study of refugee politics and policy. But when we look at the current crisis as it's been characterized in Europe, for instance, around refugees, we recognize an important role for other new emerging actors, and numerous examples stand out. From the 11,000 Icelandic families to offer accommodation, to Google's offer to crowdfund, engaging crowdfund matching for Syrian refugee charities, to the Swedish entrepreneur behind the Refugee Air idea, to the Refugees Welcome social movement across Europe, to Hamdi Ulukhaya's pledge to give $700 million of his own money to refugee causes, private actors and non-state actors are playing a prevalent and influential role. If we think about immediate policy to emerge in relation to the crisis, the story is similar. This week alone, the European Union has proposed a quota scheme for 120,000 refugees to be relocated across Europe. If we look at that outcome, it's not simply the product of interstate power relations. There have been complex influences behind the scenes in terms of those that have come up with the ideas, those that have been part of the networks of discussion and guided those conversations. Similarly, next week, there'll be a side meeting at the UN General Assembly to explore solutions to the Mediterranean and Syrian crisis. And the sources of influence that explain that outcome and how it's come about so quickly can't simply be reduced to state power and state interests. So I think there's a research agenda around these issues and these new actors, which entails a number of questions. First, which non-state actors engage with global refugee policy and in which areas? Second, under what conditions do they exert influence? Third, at what stage of the governance or policy process do they have that impact? Fourth, what motivates their involvement? Fifth, which areas of forced migration do they get involved in and why? And sixth, when can they be regarded as playing a normatively desirable role or not? These questions matter for how we conceptualize the politics of refugee studies and forced migration, but they also matter for policymakers, because if we can understand the role of these new actors and their influence, we can shape it for better. In this paper, I draw together examples from three sets of new actors. Firstly, business. Secondly, epistemic communities, including academics. And thirdly, the role of refugees themselves. And to do that, I draw upon three different current research projects that I'm engaged in. In the first case of business, I'm drawing upon work that I've done on the role of business in relation to refugees in Uganda as part of a project on refugee economies, which is a forthcoming book project with my colleagues Louise Bloom, Josiah Kaplan, and Naohiko Amata. In the second case, to look at epistemic communities, I look at the role and influence of academics and knowledge actors in the emerging standard setting on environmental displacement. And that draws upon work with Angela Pilath in a forthcoming article in Journal of International Relations and Development. And finally, in looking at the role of refugees, I look at the mobilization of refugees in exile to contest the Zimbabwean and Rwandan regimes, which is part of a book project called The Animators, How Diasporas Mobilize to Contest Authoritarianism, which will be a book which will be out with Cambridge University Press next year. So I want to briefly look at those three examples and show where we see impact and influence on the global refugee regime. So firstly, the role of business. As I said, there's a literature in global governance that recognizes that business plays a role in global governance in a number of ways: lobbying, corporate social responsibility, private rulemaking and standard setting, the development of voluntary codes of conduct, private-public partnerships, philanthropy, innovation, and the role of expert knowledge. It's widely recognized by authors in international trade, the environment, and health governance. But in contrast, there's been only limited work in humanitarian governance. The work of Tom Weiss in the book Humanitarian Business stands out as exceptional. In relation to migration, there's very little work. The work of Hernandez Leon at the University of California at Los Angeles, and equally the work of Nyborg Sørensen and Gammeltoft Hansen is exceptional. But as Roger Zeta has highlighted, the private sector offers, quote, enormous yet untapped potential to improve the lives and livelihoods of both the displaced and the host. The private sector has always been present in the refugee regime in its modern incarnation. As Gil Locher has noted, because the United States didn't fund UNHCR until 1955, UNHCR's early funding depended upon private foundations. The Ford Foundation, for instance, provided a large grant to UNHCR as early as 1952. However, the role of private actors was largely neglected until the last 10 years. It was in 2006 that UNHCR tried to move towards non-traditional donors, including a move to private sector funding. And UNHCR's relationship with the private sector has arguably gone through three waves. Firstly, a wave of engaging with philanthropy and CSR between 2006 and 10, in which it hoped the private sector would write checks to support assistance. That didn't get that far. So secondly, there was a wave of what might be called engaging with core business and innovation, which began in around 2010, where more and more business was recognized as an actor that could innovate to provide better refugee assistance. For instance, the IKEA Foundation's development of a refugee housing unit. The more recent turn, though, the third wave, as I would describe it, is to recognize a multi-level ecosystem of private sector involvement. To recognize that the role of business is not just about UNHCR's relationships with businesses, but the role that business automatically and already plays in relation to refugees outside of formal institutional frameworks. For example, business operates not only globally, but also nationally, locally, and even transnationally. It's innately part of refugees. Many refugees around the world are themselves entrepreneurs. They are business people. They are creative. It only takes a walk along the Champs-Élysées in the Zaatari refugee camp to recognize refugee shops and businesses and the role of the private sector. But I think it's then important to conceptualize that role. At the moment, we lack a conceptual framework for thinking about business and its relationship to the refugee regime. What I do in the paper is to look through examples at both the national level, taking the example of Uganda, and the global level to highlight some of those roles, modes of engagement, and indeed sources of influence. And I highlight 7 areas of motive and mode of engagement through which the private sector is shaping the refugee regime. The first is in terms of philanthropy. The private sector is giving money to formal organizations and through NGOs to support refugee assistance. At the global level, examples like the Chobani Foundation stand out. At the Uganda level, local civil society organisations like a group in Kampala, Yared played that role. The second area is corporate social responsibility. Hewlett-Packard, for instance, is engaging in CSR to make its technologies and its work on IT relevant to international organisations like UNHCR. But we also see that replicated at the national level, where in Uganda, for instance, the telecommunications company MTN is increasingly involved with UNHCR at the national level. Thirdly, we see a role of the private sector in innovation. The IKEA Foundation stands out at the global level. It's put 110 million euros, the largest private sector donation ever in the history of the United Nations, into supporting UNHCR's development of the refugee housing unit, Better Shelter, amongst others. But we also see that kind of innovation at the national level. In Uganda, for instance, a social enterprise called Technology for Tomorrow has developed a product called the Makapad, a female sanitary product that is being manufactured in warehouses in the Chaka II settlement by refugees, sold to UNHCR and distributed to refugees. Fourthly, the private sector is playing a role in terms of looking at refugees as a source of labour. The San Francisco-based company Samasource is engaging in micro-work projects in the Dadaab refugee camps, for instance, to provide work on a small scale. Equally, there are variants of that at the national level. Again, in Uganda, the oil company City Oil, based mainly in Kampala and predominantly run by Ugandan Somalis, is seeking to deliberately employ Somali refugees based on clan networks and loyalty structures. Fifthly, strategic positioning has been important. Globally, telecommunications companies like Orange are building telecommunications masts and selling airtime and handsets in refugee camps. That strategic positioning also takes place at the national level. In Uganda, the Owino market, the largest marketplace in East Africa based in Kampala, looks at ways in which it can involve refugees to strategically cluster the selling of particular products. Sixth, the business sector engages in interventions in the supply chain. Zara Home has started to look at ways in which it can import products from Syrian artisans based in Lebanon and sell them on the global market. That plays out at the national level too, where an enterprise called Nile Breweries at the Ugandan level is seeking to buy sorghum from a collective called the Changwali Progressive Farmers Limited in a settlement in Uganda. Finally, social enterprise is another way in which business is engaging through initiatives like Refugee Air or Refugees United, and these ideas replicate at the national level. So all of that's to say, business is conceptually complicated. It has different sources of influence and different motives at different levels, and we shouldn't neglect it as an actor. The second example I want to look at is what's often referred to as epistemic communities, the role of academics, knowledge actors, think tanks in the refugee regime. Far from being objective actors who simply observe and examine trends in human displacement, academics and universities often play an active and direct role in policy making in the refugee regime. They do so based on advocacy, consultancy, and often their small world networks where relatively few people located in universities and think tanks have strong personal and social networks as well as professional relationships with key policy makers. Many meetings today comprise representatives of government, NGOs, as well as think tanks and academia. In the existing international relations literature, Peter Haas has written about epistemic communities, particularly developing that work with an empirical focus on the development of the Mediterranean pollution control regime of the 1990s. But Haas's work is somewhat limited. It sees epistemic communities themselves as relatively apolitical actors. They have a benevolent normative goal, and their role is mainly the transmission of information to policymakers. In practice, this is a rather two-dimensional view of Homo academicus. The role of the academic is far from just the unitary transmission mechanism for objective knowledge, but rather academics and knowledge actors often have complex identities in the ways in which they seek to shape policy. They're often embedded in politics and policy networks themselves. The role of knowledge matters particularly in the area of forced migration, I would argue, because, as I've argued, and as Susan Martin makes clear in her recent book, migration and forced migration linked closely to what might be referred to as nexus areas. It's closely related to areas like security, the environment, development, and that's why we hear themes like migration and development, migration and the environment. And in that context, causal knowledge matters. The relationship between an action in area X, an outcome in area Y, and the way we understand it shapes policy. We need to understand causal effects about how an action leads to an outcome, and so knowledge matters. In the area of environmental displacement, this has been particularly prevalent. In the very early debate, there was a demand for knowledge and evidence. And when policymakers started to become interested in the relationship between climate change and mobility, that evidence base wasn't there. And so they immediately went to a lot of the work that was available, particularly the work of Norman Myers. And Norman Myers made fairly, in his words, Herculean extrapolations in order to highlight the degree of people who would be displaced as a result of climate change over the course of the century. That work had many conceptual challenges, but it was greatly influential to policymakers and was cited by IOM and others early in the debate. As the debate advanced, key knowledge actors became particularly important in trying to justify and show a causal relationship between climate change and displacement. For instance, between January 2007 and May 2009, a European Commission-funded project called EACH4 engaged in a large number of case studies to show that relationship. Its aim was explicitly not to test, question, or be critical of that relationship, but to show those causal effects. And even though many of its claims didn't meet the standards of falsifiability within social scientific knowledge, they had immense influence on that early policy debate. In the paper, I developed the example of the first standard setting on environmental displacement, the case of paragraph 14F of the Cancun Adaptation Framework that was outlined at COP16 in Cancun, Mexico in December 2010. And the genesis of that is particularly interesting because it highlights the kind of knowledge claims that were used relating to causality and the actors and influences that led to that outcome. And predominantly what we can see is that key actors, notably the role of the United Nations University EHS, the Environment and Human Security Programme based in Bonn, had a profound influence in agenda setting and the eventual outcome in terms of the first standard setting in this particular area. Key individuals like Coco Warner played that role in relation to a large number of other people. And it's not a case of making a judgment about whether that was normatively good or bad as an outcome, but simply recognizing that the influence is there is something that we often shy away from as academics, partly because it's very close to home and many of us are actually involved in these types of influence and activity. But it doesn't make them any less influential or significant for our analytical purposes. The third example I look at is the role of refugees themselves. There's often been a characterization, certainly in political theory, of refugees as passive, apolitical victims. And that characterization has not been aided by an often misappropriation of the ideas of people like Hannah Arendt and Giorgio Agamben, characterizing refugees as bare life. In practice, this process of denuding refugees of political identity couldn't be further from the truth. Refugees engage in a whole variety of political activity. Very often people go into exile precisely because the space for political activity and activism within the country of origin is removed. And so what happens is the geographical space for political contestation shifts from the country of origin to the transnational realm and the host countries. In the work that I've been doing in this area, what we've looked at is the specific case of how refugee diasporas mobilize to contest authoritarian governments back home. And we've looked at two examples of Zimbabwean refugees and Rwandan refugees over the last 15 years. And in each case, we've undertaken multi-sited fieldwork, carrying out over 250 interviews. For the Zimbabweans, we did research in South Africa, Botswana, the UK, and the US. For Rwandans, we did research in Uganda, Belgium, France, and the United Kingdom. And in each of those cases, we were able to show the process by which those groups mobilised and had influence or not on the government back home. What was interesting was to look at the constraints on that action and the sources of influence. And while we were able to show that certain refugee elites were in a position to have significant influence, what we found was a group of actors who we refer to as animators were very active behind the scenes, notably governments, foundations, human rights activists, often mobilised and channelled the role of refugees in order to exert influence on the politics back home, but also on global governance. To take one specific example from the work, we look at the campaign against the invocation of the cessation clause for Rwandan refugees. In that case, a number of refugees can be clearly identified as playing a lead role in disputing UNHCR's invocation of the cessation clause, arguing that it was bad for human rights, bad for Rwandan refugees who might have to be returned back to the Kagame regime. But what was interesting about that protest movement is while it involved a number of refugees, the refugees who were able to engage and were often selected as influential by particular human rights activists from outside the country were not necessarily representative of the wider set of perspectives, and some voices became silenced. Equally, when we look at the Zimbabwean case, an interesting pattern emerges of political activity by refugees. Zimbabweans predominantly left Mugabe's government after the year 2000 as a result of a variety of causes, political persecution, but also famine, hyperinflation, state collapse, and the economic situation in the country. Many of those Zimbabweans in South Africa then developed a series of political activities between 2003 and 2008. In that period, there were major successes of refugee mobilization. Just to give you two examples, refugees were able to mobilize to block an arms shipment destined from China to Zimbabwe at the port of Durban in 2008. To give you another example, around 2008 and 9, refugee-led NGOs and groups within South Africa were able to shape South Africa's immigration policy and lobby for a moratorium on the deportation of Zimbabweans from South Africa back to Zimbabwe. But something very interesting happened after 2008, which is that even though the situation back home had only changed marginally with the government of national unity, diasporic activity started to wane and dissipate. And the reason for that shift is that the money that had been going into that activity up till 2008 shifted. It shifted from being used to support the diaspora to being focused more on the politics of Harare and going back to Zimbabwe. And so what that highlighted for us was that a lot of this refugee activity and its political engagement was shaped by outside actors, by the money of key donors like the United States, the United Kingdom, Scandinavian governments, and a select group of foundations seeking to channel that into political influence rather than being authentically a representative voice of refugees. So those three cases, which I admit are quite disparate, highlight, I hope, that states are not the only relevant actors in global refugee policy. Indeed, business, epistemic communities, and refugees themselves exert direct causal influence on refugee policy outcomes at the global level. The paper also demonstrates that this impact is at different stages of the policy cycle. In relation to business, a lot of that influence is at the level of implementation. It's about the direct provision of assistance to refugees. But it also highlights a growing influence on agenda setting and the development of new norms and standards. Businesses are involved in core activities at the heart of international organisation debates and are seeking to shape governments' perspectives. In the case of epistemic communities, a lot of the influence is in agenda setting, but equally the role is more complex. There's a direct role in terms of policy participation in standard setting. In the case of refugees, again, part of the role is at the level of implementation of standards, contesting those standards, disputing whether and where and how immigration rules, refugee recognition standards are applied by governments. But equally, refugees are playing active roles as transnational actors in global governance in their own right. So I think these findings suggest there's a need for a research agenda that unpacks the specific and diverse contributions of these new actors and non-state actors, and calls for theory and methods that take us beyond a purely state-centric approach. Thanks very much.